So there will be no...
So it looks
it's for
like...
the picture.
So it looks like...
Really, you want me to do... So you're asking me to do this for you?
Impersonating someone speaking.
It's a different sense of the performative than the one that you were talking about, but still, we can play. No, I can. It's all right. No, this is faux. It's complètement faux. Okay.
It's a prop.
No, wait, it's a prop. Okay. So, and I'm playing a role apparently. Athena, thank you for your wonderful paper. I wanted to ask you whether the implications of your argument is that we have to rethink some of these temporal schemes that we use to think about political organizing that's non-state-centered versus forms of political organizing that are state-centered. So, of course, some people will tell the story of Syriza, for instance, as moving from a popular movement into a party politics and then government. And it seems to me that you are asking us not to think of that as a set of steps, even though historically we can recount that transition, because whatever there is of the deinstitutionalized or the not completely institutionalized form of politics that gave rise to Syriza, or which was part of its inception, for you must remain part of its contemporary political self-understanding. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about that, the simultaneity of the institutionalized and the non-institutionalized in the present moment, and maybe at some point if you would also explain what you meant by the coup. I mean, I have an idea of what you meant by the coup, but it would be good to hear your version.
So I'll just go ahead and thank you, Judith, for this very helpful question that you're posing. As you already put it, it's not a matter of a kind of transition from one modality to another, at least not in my mind. I can acknowledge, though, that this is in many people's mind. It's sometimes in several levels it has become a kind of a source of self-aggrandizing modality for some people within Syriza, that we're now in power and we don't really focus our work on the level of social movements. But this is a very, very problematic and very distorting idea of what the genealogy of Syriza is all about. But again, this is my partial, very much situated perspective. And I think that, and what I try to do here is exactly to problematize this rigid distinction between state-centered and not state-centered way of doing politics. I mean, of course there's a tension there. We have to acknowledge that sometimes there is a tension, but this is a good tension, I think. This is a very enabling, performative tension between state-centered and non-state-centered politics. I think a very good example of that is how these two distinct but interrelated perspectives envision the concept of solidarity, for example. As I said before at the very beginning of my talk, this was actually the way in which Syriza came to power, exactly by doing a certain amount of work on the level of social networks of solidarity and so on and so forth. So, and then, of course, the first bill that Syriza passed was a bill which tried to condensate, in a way, all this work. It was the very problematically appellated bill on Greece's humanitarian crisis. But again, I think, for example, that there's a lot of work to be done in revisiting and re-envisioning the concept of solidarity beyond identity politics and in opposition, I would say, to exclusionary demarcations through which people are bound together as one. In a way, I would be thinking that it would be important to go even against the very etymology of the word solidarity, if we take this etymology to denote, to come from this Latin element of in solidum, which means as a whole. So through these different movements that Syriza adopted in a way and worked with in a way, it's hard to find the apt way to describe that. This way embodied how solidarity does not assume that our struggles are the same and our pains are the same. There's a very interesting way in which Sarah Ahmed talks about that. I find this very, very enabling, that solidarity does not have to do with similarity of experience or pain or injury, or it has to do with work. It has to do with commitment and work, as well as to with recognition that even if we do not have the same feelings or the same experiences or the same lives, there's a point at which we're bound to come together in a way, even if we don't exactly live on common ground. Then the coup. What I implied was the famous hashtag, this is a coup, that was very famous on the very day of Syriza's signing the memorandum on the 13th of July. You see, my understanding is this. That was a huge defeat. To my mind, that was not just a defeat of Syriza. It was a defeat of the European left. It was a defeat of the European democracy. But what this performative action of this is a coup tried to do was exactly that, to, I think, again, in my mind, to signal the ways in which Syriza was authorized to come to power without institutional authorization, in a way. Syriza had to go against and despite the existing institutional and institutionalized authorization, in a way. So, and I think the international public opinion captured that, although I don't think that what would we call international solidarity, with all these trepidations that this word carries, was not enough at all. I think that it was very courageous, but it was not enough. But on the same side, this very interesting performative gesture of this is a coup, captured very nicely that tension, the tension which had to do with the fact that Syriza inserted dissent and disagreement within a space, within the space of the EU, the Eurozone, inserted this element of dissent in a space which does not acknowledge even this possibility of disagreement. So I would say that, again, going back to this question that Hannah Arendt had posed once in a feminist conference, by the way, what would we lose if we win? I take this very seriously, but I think it works on the other side too, right? I mean, we have to think what we won by losing. And I think one of the things that was won there was exactly this element of disagreement, which attracted different sensibilities and modalities of collective thinking and acting. I don't know if that answer to your... Because it's a...
In the way you talk about institutions, there's an ambiguity. Ambiguity between institutions in the sense of political institutions, which might have a constitution, certain rules, and other kinds of things about how they function, and institutions in the sense of the reality of power and what's authorized and what is not. The case of Greece makes it pretty clear when you just said Syriza came to power without the authorization of the institutions. What I take it you were referring to was the realities of power. There's no public institution which forbids Syriza from coming to power. Again, Varoufakis asked the important question in the Eurogroup, what are the rules of how this group is meant to work? Am I allowed to be expelled? And he was told it's an informal grouping. So I think it's important with no rules. So I wanted to ask you to clarify a bit about the institutions, particularly because when you talk about trying to save some things in the institutions as we kind of rebel against them, one important thing to save maybe in liberal institutions, we can still call them that, is precisely the space of liberty. I'm coming from France the other day where we've just voted, the Parliament's just voted to suppress liberty, at least temporarily, although it seems like they want to do it indefinitely. So there's something to be said about exactly what you mean by institutions and what's to be saved from the startlingly large amount of reflection on the space of liberty in those institutions.
Just a wholesale return to liberalism. Because one thing I've been thinking about when you mentioned resistance assumes that there is something to defend. But what there is to defend is already not neutral. For instance, when you brought up the book Protest, in and of itself, it assumes already the existence of a political community that recognizes the value of classics, of what we define as classics, right? And it assumes the existence of a political community that values literature as such, which is neither universal nor non-historical. So I was just wondering if you would care to elaborate a bit on that.
Thank you. Thank you both. Very insightful questions. First question. Yes, that's what I do. I address this ambiguity and try to see how this ambiguity can become a source of not even mobilizing these terms in a different way, but also of doing politics in general in a different way. You mentioned the space of liberty. Of course, and this is a reason for which I criticize, I imply the criticism towards a certain theoretical tendency which comes up very often lately, which assumes that democracy just belongs to the realm of liberalism, and thus it's nothing more than a weapon of the capitalist state. I think a good example would be Alain Badiou's work, in a way that he considers Balibar and other people who try to radicalize or are involved in radicalizing democracy to be reformist. He has written that the real enemy today is not called empire or capital, but rather democracy, and so on and so forth. On the other side, I'm very much more interested in the work like Etienne Balibar and Judith Butler and others are doing in terms of how this mutual complicity of democracy and capitalism can be remobilized and redeployed in a cataclysmic way. What Balibar defines as equiliberty, for example, I think it's very much to the point, as nothing other than the demand of popular sovereignty and autonomy without exclusions. Now, Are we to reduce critical agency to just or simply popular sovereignty? I don't think so. Not that there is anything simple or given today about popular sovereignty, but I think that we have to preserve a space for a critique towards liberal democracy too at the same time. So while defending institutions, we rebel against the institutions at the same time, and these different levels are very much intertwined with one another. We don't defend institutions as a matter of principle of defending existing democracy, I think, but we defend precisely our possibility to engage in a critical politics towards existing democracy. So in a nutshell, I would say that this is a different perspective of what democracy is all about. And to my mind, democracy is a struggle, is a constant dispute and dissent and stasis, even revolution, rather than an established, instituted regime of politics. And to go a step further, I would say that it would be interesting to think democracy in terms of what of this Benjaminian idea of force without power, which is something that Derrida takes up too in his notion of what's it called, force de la faiblesse, force of weakness. So that's why I mentioned at the beginning that it's very important to address this distinction between power to and power over, because that's something that we have to address when we're interested in take the power in order to change the world. Who defines what is authorized as power, and who defines how power is authorized as in specific spaces of allocation and distribution and so on and so forth. Non-essentialist politics, well, what I have in mind is, again, there's a level of implied critique here, of course. What I find difficulty with is this tendency to define the subject of action. Once again, we have this very routine critique which has been used to attack deconstruction, performativity. This question: where is agency and where is action? And you reflect so much, you don't act. This kind of very problematic. And I think that we run a danger here to revert in a way to this kind of thinking. So when we, as we have come together to think about how to act together, I would say that it's always very important to I don't want to say to reflect, because again, I replay this distinction between reflecting and acting, but this readiness to self-organize in a very programmatic way, to me, is very much resonant to this kind of even neoliberal obsession with finding solutions to things. Although I think that this alternative modality of power takes time. That's why I want to talk about this. About this, what I call performative dialectics of defeat. Some people, former comrades, even who splintered from Syriza, think that defeat was the end of the world, right? I mean, that was the end of the world. Whereas I think that this is an ongoing struggle, and we cannot live now, even if we, like to consider the possibility of living. This is when things have become really harsh, and you have to stay there and defend your grounds in a way. So I think that we have to preserve this space for open contingency, for our struggles and for our impulses to understand who is the we who acts. That's a very, very. That's why I try to imply this dual critique towards both. The reverting back to individualistic, atomistic, liberal, self-willed subject, and on the other side, the what I understand as a subject of the commons. Again, it's very complicated because these are not homogeneous sets of literature and ways of thinking. So I'm compelled to be a little all-encompassing here, and this is not fair, of course, but just to make the argument here.